We Should Have Never Played in the Junkyard, written by Ryden Ann. Trash should have been my first name growing up. It wasn't the way that I carried myself, and it wasn't the way my family was. Sure, we were poor, but we weren't dirty or anything. It was just that stupid town that we lived in. Rural, but rich. If your parents didn't own a farm or work on one, you were considered one of the poor kids. The trash. Of course, there are choices that didn't help my reputation. Call it teen rebellion, I guess, but sometimes I think I tried to out-trash people's opinion once I got older. That's how I, along with my best friend Mick, started to hang out at the junkyard. Now, it wasn't really a junkyard, not officially. The woman who owned the land was a hoarder, and that's putting it generously. I mean, there were acres upon acres of land with just stuff on it. Rusted down cars by the dozens, broken appliances, and other piles upon piles of junk. Delia was a wispy-haired woman with a thick southern accent who owned the land. Growing up, we had heard all kinds of stories about her. Mostly that she was some sort of witch, though the adults mostly just said that she was crazy. I'd overheard my mother talking about her many times after crossing paths with her at the market or wherever. Such a nice lady. It's so sad that she's nuts. All that money and all that land, but she's too focused on crap. And she really was. Most people in town just stopped throwing certain stuff out because they knew that she'd just come by and pick it up before the trash men could come. Instead, they started opting to drop things off. That's actually how our fascination got sparked. Let me point out that Mick's parents were never around. His dad was a trucker, his mom worked double shifts. Me being an only child and my mom almost always being home to care for me, Mick was essentially my brother and was always with me from kindergarten on. That's why he was with me that day when my dad was dropping off our old fridge. The coils that kept the freezer cold had finally crapped out for the last time. Delia came out from a trail of trashy treasures poking out of the overgrown grass. She gave my father a smile that was magnetic, and I was completely enamored with her life. As was Mick. I mean, from everything we'd heard so far, I'd assumed that she would be wild and unhappy. At least embarrassed by her situation. No, this woman radiated positivity. I mean, I'd seen her before in town and she looked happy. But she truly had this energy that was hard to hate. Later that week, Mick and I hopped some fences until we got into Delia's property. You didn't need a map to know, you could just see the pileup from miles away. Exploring her land was something that we'd talked about from the minute Dad took us back home. We were both 14 and a little too old to be playing pretend, but we couldn't stop coming up with ideas for how we could make the junkyard our battlegrounds. We went a few times without being caught. We sneaked around and there was a definitive thrill we both derived from the fear. However, when Delia found the two of us using garbage piles as barricades for an imaginary war, she was still bright and positive. We both quickly stopped our play and did as kids often do, lined up to be reprimanded. Instead, she put a hand on Mick's shoulder. "Ain't much to do round here, eh?" We both shook our heads. "Yep, always been like this. If you kids are really looking to have some fun, you might want to walk about 5 minutes that-a-way," she said as she pointed further into her land. "Cars and stuff are a little less rusted. Don't want you kids getting some kind of infection on my watch," she said, and she smiled and turned away, starting off in a different direction. Mick spoke up. "Wait, we can play here?" Delia turned around, the same smile still on her face. "Well, sure. Just be careful and respectful of my things, you understand?" We both nodded and she started off again, stopping every so often to check out a discarded item before gently placing it back down and continuing her winding but meticulous path. She'd been right. Just heading a couple of minutes into the junkyard provided us with newer garbage and other landscapes that seemed almost like something out of fantasy. our imaginations ran wild. We hung out there almost every day. Most times we wouldn't even see Delia. I mean, there was just so much land and so much to do there. Our paths rarely crossed. Still, we'd see other people around sometimes. We weren't the only cast-offs to find refuge there. Sometimes you'd find homeless people sleeping in abandoned cars and campers. People would also be there looking for junk parts. It wasn't abnormal to have your play be interrupted by someone wandering through. We found a huge expanse of field that was nothing but refrigerators and other appliances. Newer, older, and in various stages of rust. We'd imagine that they were trees and that we were chasing one another through the forest, a bounty hunter and an escaped convict. I was getting ready to turn the corner around an old Frigidaire and arrest Mick when the creaking, moaning sound of rust broke the both of us out of our imaginative storyline. Mick stood up from his kneeling position and came up next to me as I turned myself around to search for the source of the sound. My eyes searched between the rusted husks until they landed on one of those old 60s models. The ones that look like spaceships. The door had opened just a crack before stopping. I started to turn away when the groaning noise returned again. Sure enough, the door was opening. We stayed like statues in place for a while, waiting for the door to open again, but it didn't. Arming ourselves with nearby scrap metal, the both of us crept over to the fridge and pulled on the door. It didn't want to give way until the two of us pulled with both hands. It was stuck good and it creaked much, much louder when we opened it. The inside was bare. There was nothing, no person, just rust. Neither of us wanted to admit how frightened we were, but we weren't exactly ready to just resume play either. So we quietly backed off of the area and ran home. It was probably the longest time that we'd spent away from Delia's land. Being away didn't stop us from constantly speculating once we knew that we were safe, of course. There were moments we would rationalize to the best of our ability, but it didn't take long for that to descend into stranger explanations when rationality clearly couldn't apply anymore. We had to go back. It's strange. Delia's land is so expansive that it's kind of hard to find the same place 2 days in a row. We found other fields of fridges and other appliances, but not that field with that refrigerator. It took 2 weeks and almost forgetting about it entirely for us to stumble upon it once again. We both went straight to that same old fridge. It looked like it could have been blue in its heyday, but years of rust and sunshine had faded it away. The door had been closed again. It wasn't nearly as hard for the two of us to get it open this time, and we found it unsurprisingly empty. The two of us stood there in silence for a moment before it seemed like Mick got an idea. "Close me inside," he said as he climbed in before I could protest and started trying to pull the door closed on himself, which clearly wasn't working. I didn't immediately step forward to help and instead protested. "What if the door gets stuck? How am I going to explain that to my mom?" I said. He laughed as he continued to try and pull the door closed, rocking the fridge and nearly knocking it over. "I can hold my breath a really, really long time. You'll figure out the rest," he said. Sighing, I resigned myself to closing the door on him. Though not all the way initially. I could hear him from the inside. All the way," he yelled. The door touched the frame and settled there. I stepped back and stood again in silence. A few seconds passed. "Hey, what's it like?" I yelled. No answer. Not even a muffled one. I rolled my eyes and stepped back towards the fridge, grabbing and yanking the door back open with surprising ease. "Yeah, you're not gonna scare me," I said, before stopping abruptly. It was empty. For a moment, it was like my brain just stopped functioning. I stared dumbly at the rusted back of the old fridge. Before my thoughts arranged themselves, I already felt myself stepping forward and touching the inside, pressing hard against the back, smacking it, punching it in a frightened panic. I started yelling for Mick. yelling into the empty fridge until rationality started to pull me back again. I backed off and began searching the other appliances, tearing doors open and frantically yelling for my friend. I opened every single door on every fridge, deep freeze unit, and oven with no luck. He wasn't behind them or among the outlying piles of trash. He was just gone. As if on cue, or even maybe her own instinct, Delia approached from somewhere unseen. "What's going on here? Y'all gotta find somewhere else to play," she said. She stopped and looked around at all the open doors, concerned. "Hey, where's that other kid?" she asked. I started to break down. I could barely explain through the sudden burbles of sobs that were coming from somewhere inside my gut. My mind couldn't make sense of what was happening, but Delia didn't seem particularly shocked and just sighed before going around and closing all of the doors, shaking her head as she got to her work. She kept repeating, "This is bad. This is real bad for us, kid." Once all the doors were closed again, she came back over to me. "Show me which unit he went into." I led her over to the spacey 60s fridge. She closed and opened the door a few times with no change. She backed off and sat down on an old toaster oven. At first, I thought she was in deep, worried thought, but after 15 minutes or so, it became clear that she was waiting for something. Then, there it was again. The creak and groan of a rusted hinge trying desperately to open against time's toll. Only this time, it was one of those meat storage freezers that opened from the top. Whatever was crouched inside had pushed the lid open just a sliver. Glossy, silver, bauble-like eyes peered out from the darkness inside. They were round and wide, with no iris or pupil to break the cascaded swirl of chrome color that made them up. Just as the lid started to close again, Delia leapt to her feet and barreled towards the freezer. It noticed and tried to retreat faster, but couldn't disappear before the surprisingly spry old woman yanked the door open entirely and peered inside. Her face was painted with both fear and fury as she shouted inside, "Don't you dare run, you coward!" A scream erupted from somewhere deep inside the freezer, high-pitched and almost metallic sounding. A black, disgustingly contorted hand reached up towards Delia and gripped her hard on her arm. It yanked her a little, but she wasn't budging. Instead, she reached her other arm down with it. "You give me that kid back," she screamed. It was clear that she was trying to pull the thing out. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs had become jelly beneath me, and I'd knelt down moments before without noticing. She'd gotten some good pull on the thing, and I was starting to become overwhelmingly frightened that I would have to see those disgusting chrome eyeballs again. But it seemed it had also started to realize that she had the upper hand. It let go of her arm, and she let go in turn. Then she was holding on to something heavy, pulling it up to the surface. He'd come up head first, Delia pulling him under the shoulders with all of her might. Mick was unconscious and dirty, looking as if he'd been gone for days, although it hadn't been more than an hour. As the last of his legs came up, she collapsed backwards and barely dodged his body toppling onto her. My own body was finally responding to my brain again, and I sprinted over to them. She was already trying to shake him awake with no response. It was only when I knelt down and began begging him to wake up that his eyes started to flutter. Then his entire face scrunched up in pain as blood began to pool from his tear ducts and run down his face. Pain overwhelmed his body and he screamed, "My eyes! My eyes!" Delia quickly rose to her feet and began to leave. "Stay with him. I'm calling 911. You better come up with a good story by the time they get here, kid," she told me. I tried to comfort him through his wails and pain, but I was overwhelmed and terribly frightened. I couldn't stop my eyes from darting between each and every appliance in the field, terrified of seeing those swirly, sickly baubles peeking out at me again.